Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video in the lecture series for the course of database design and implementation. In this video, I'm going to be discussing two different topics. The first one is basically the installation of MySQL community server and then verifying that you have correctly installed the server and that is working. And thereafter, I'm going to be talking about another component of the MySQL environment, which is known as the MySQL Workbench. Workbench is essentially the interface that MySQL provides along with its server such that you can interact with your database server until you have developed your own um, interface to work with the database server. Okay. So essentially what we are going to be doing or what we are going to be discussing in the Workbench topic is how to draw your own entity relationship diagram using closed foot notation, which essentially is one of the most crucial tasks in order to generate a conceptual design for any database and something that you will be working with or you will need for some of your homeworks and then primarily your project work. Okay, so coming to the first topic, which is MySQL Community Server. Before we get into the installation part, there are two things that you have to keep in mind, which is essentially the prerequisites or at times leads to some of the different installation errors that you can encounter, right? So basically what you need if you're working in the Windows environment is the .NET framework. Okay, so if you have a very new computer, then there are possibilities where you may not have the .NET framework pre-installed. Okay, it depends on where you have purchased your computer from and stuff like that. So not Microsoft, but MySQL Community Server will not be able to install itself if you don't have the .NET framework. It will simply just ignore the installation of your community server. The rest of the stuff will work, but then if your server is not there, well, nothing else will function. So just go to this link if you don't have it, and then install your .NET framework. If you are in doubt whether you have or do not have the .NET framework, then if you're working on at least the Windows distributable, then go to control panel and then programs and features installed, and then check if you have the .NET framework installed. Okay, so if you go there, you can basically download the runtime environment and then just follow the prompts of your executable, and then it will basically install the .NET framework for you. Okay, but the second thing that you need is the Visual C++ redistributable. Okay, now the thing about this is if you don't have this already on your computer for the x64 and the 86 architectures, then when you are going through the server installation for MySQL Community Server, it will take care of it for you. Okay, it will ask you that you don't have this, whether you would like to install it, then just go along with the prompt and install it. So keep in mind that as far as installation is concerned, the majority of the issues that you will have is with respect to these two topics. So if you hit a glitch, then first make sure that these two aspects are addressed before you start looking into other reasons why you are having issues. Okay. So thereafter, coming to the installation guide, a note before we look into what we need to do. Keep in mind that there is a step-by-step document which is listing with snapshots as to how to install your MySQL Server and MySQL Workbench, right? So everything that I am talking about right now is documented in that document, which is available on Moodle. Okay, so make sure you keep that handy as well in case you want to revisit some of the steps that you need to follow or that you need to look out for when you're trying to install the server. Okay, so if you just Google MySQL Community Server download, right, The first result is basically what you have to visit. So when you go there, you will get a prompt like this. So ignore this part here, which you have, the other downloads thing. What you have to do is focus on this part here. Select your operating system, depending on whether you're working on a Linux distribution or if you're working on Macintosh. Just select whatever it is that you work with, and then you just go to the download page. Okay, so once you go to the download page, it will give you two options. Okay, so one is the internet enabled installer. So that means if you have internet connection, then you can go with this installer because it can then dynamically download all the other components that it comes with. But however, if you're going to be installing it later on in an offline fashion, then go for the full directory of MySQL server, right? But if you already have internet, which most of you should, then just go for the download of the internet enabled installer or the runtime installer, right? So you hit that, you select that option, ignore all of these. You don't have to if you don't want to. If you want to, then you can do it, but then otherwise you just select no thanks, just start my download, and then it will ask you to save the installer, right? So once you have the installer, after that everything else is more or less straightforward. You follow the prompts that are there or that will be given to you. Okay, so after that you will be given all these different component options that comes with the installer. So the main thing that you have to keep in mind, the two components that you need is basically the server, the database server, and then the interface to the database server that is provided by MySQL, which is the MySQL Workbench, where essentially you can also design your database schema, okay, using the crow's foot notation. So from all of these components that you will be provided here, you will just select the important ones, which is the server and then the MySQL Workbench. Okay, so other than that, all these open database connectors, the C++ connector, the Java connector, the Python connector, you don't necessarily need any of these. If you want to keep MySQL shell, you can keep it, but you can also work through your terminals as well. Okay, so you don't essentially have to do that. So once you select that, since my server and Workbench is already installed, I did not see that option or for that component option available there. Okay, it just gave me the options for the remaining components which I had previously downloaded, whether I wanted to upgrade that to its newest version. So if it is a fresh installation for you, then you will see MySQL server, community server, and then MySQL Workbench. So make sure that those two are selected, and then you execute the installation, and then it will go through that process. Okay. So I don't essentially want to upgrade it, but as you can see here, my server is already up to date with the latest version, and that is why I did not see it, right? And so is my Workbench. And the options that I saw there was the components which had an available upgrade there. So for you, you will be only selecting these two, MySQL Server and then MySQL Workbench, and then you're going to execute it. Okay, and then follow the different prompts. So all the default options that you will be given, just select that. You don't want to or need to make any changes. The only thing as you move forward with it is it will ask you to set up what is known as the root account, which is basically the admin account within the MySQL Server environment. Do not change the username. The username is always going to remain by default as root. You can, but it's not preferred. Okay, because later on, if you create other users, then you can give them specific usernames there. So by default, naming convention wise, database servers, the admin account is always known as root. Okay. Password is whatever your password you desire. You can give it, but the main thing is to remember the password, because every time you're going to log in, you're going to log in as a root user, and then you're going to use that password regardless whether you access it through any kind of terminal or access it through the Workbench graphical interface. Okay, or even when you're going to develop or write your own web application and you're going to interface it with your database, you need to provide it with the root credentials if it is accessing through the root credentials. So please keep in mind that whatever password you use, remember it. If you forget it, there is no recovery option that send me an email to recover the option. Okay, it's not going to work out. So just use something that you remember. Okay. So once your installation is done and everything, it will open up. It will ask you to open up Workbench and stuff like that. So there are two ways where you can check your server installation. One is through the traditional means, which is essentially going through a command line interface in order to access your MySQL server, execution of your MySQL server. So if you're on a Windows distribution, this is basically the directory where your MySQL server executable resides. If you're in the Linux or the Mac directory, then try to identify where your MySQL server is installed. You basically have to find where the MySQL folder is, and then the corresponding C program files for your Mac and Linux environment. Okay, so if I go there, if I go to program files and then if I traverse to that directory, right? So this is what my server directory is, and then within the bin folder, I basically have the executable, right? So there what you can do is you can shift right click and then open a command prompt here, okay? Since I have a PowerShell installed, which is like a which kind of mirrors the commands and the operations that you get from a Linux terminal or a Mac terminal, this is what I'm looking at, right? But you can, if you're on Windows, you can also do it with the available command prompt that you have, right? The differences are minor. You cannot use ls for listing files in a Windows command prompt. You have to use dir, but you can do both for Linux and stuff like that. So that's some minor differences and just the choice of what is more convenient to you, right? So you can do this, or you can open the terminal from your start menu, and then you can use your change directory command in order to traverse to this folder, okay? But then you have to write a lot of file names and stuff like that. So if Windows is user friendly and gives you an interface, then just use it, okay? So you can open the PowerShell there, right? And what the difference is, if you're working on a basic command prompt for Windows, your command is essentially going to be just simply MySQL in order to execute an executable. But if you're working on a Linux environment and a Mac environment, you need to precede that executable command name with a // okay? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to basically // MySQL, that's the name of my executable, and then -u, which is basically the user, is going to be root, and it has a password associated with it. So once you hit enter to that, then it will ask you for the password. So you're going to enter the password, and you will get a welcome prompt, which is going to verify that your MySQL server is running, right? So this welcome prompt is something that you will get both for your Linux and Mac as well. But a thing to keep in mind is that when you're working with Linux and Mac, I don't know exactly which directory it will host the folder, but it is a what do you call it? It's not a public directory as such. So keep in mind that you might have to use the sudo command, super user do, before this MySQL, this .MySQL, right? So it knows that you are the admin of the computer and you have access to, you have authorized access to get to those folders, okay? When you're trying to run an executable within that folder. So at this point, you're basically free to play around with different set of commands, right? Or run any kind of SQL queries that you would like to, right? So if you don't know the SQL queries, that's fine. What you can do here is you can try a few basic commands like show databases, right? So it will give you a list on the command line interface of the different databases that is available. So thereafter you can do, some of them are like by default they're present, they come with the server installation. Some of them are made by us, by the admin users. So for example, here I have classic models, inventory management, world is an example of the documentation. But these two are made by me, right? Whereas the information schema, the performance schema, the MySQL, and all these other, the system table, these are something that um, MySQL Server has by default generated in order to keep a track of the different things that are happening within the database environment. That is, what are the other databases, how many tables do they have, what are the attributes, what are their performance, how many times have they been accessed, how many indexes do they have, database indexes, and stuff like that, right? So then thereafter, if you have installed the 8.0 and above version, you will be having the world database with you, right? So you can choose the world database, right? And then you can go for a command like show tables, right? And then you can basically run a very simple command and say that select star from country, okay, and then limit 10, okay, and then it will give you a set of values, right? So I think this is what it does. Yeah, so if you use a /g, it will give a grouping of all the queries that are there. So the good thing is, if you don't use the grouping, then depending on the resolution of your command line interface, it won't be able to show you in a very aesthetically pleasing fashion the output of your tables or of your queries, right? So basically, if you use this command /grouping, right, then you can see it and interact with it within the command line interface in a more structured fashion, and you can get an idea of the table, right? So there are various commands that you can use, right? So you can play around with it a bit. So if you use DESC, which is describe, and then a table name, then it will show you the schema of that particular table. That is, what are the different attributes that are present, what are their data type, what is the attribute domain, right? Can it have null values? What is the key? Is it a primary key? Can it have different multiple values? Okay, and stuff like that. Okay, and does it have a default value, and any other comments, okay, where auto increment basically stands for that the system is going to manage the value of the ID, right? So it's going to start from some specified value, or if you don't specify it, then it's going to take care of the default value, and then it's going to go from there. Okay, so this is basically the traditional way through command line interface to just check your installation server is working or not, and then just verify that your database server is working. The other option that you have to check your installation is through the MySQL Workbench. So MySQL Workbench is basically a GUI that is provided by MySQL to interact with the DB server. Okay, so until and unless you write your own GUI for your projects, you can rely on the workbench to do majority of the work. Okay, and the workbench also ships with additional benefits of being able to do your database design within the workbench environment, right? So from your system, search for MySQL Workbench. I have it pinned here. If you don't have it, then you will just go to the start menu and then search for it, or search using oh, it's Cortona, it's not Corona. So anyways, open up MySQL Workbench, and when you open up MySQL Workbench, you will be asked to add a connection, or if you want to do a new connection for a server that is running on a different computer, then you can add a connection. Typically, you will see this after the installation because you have installed the community server on your 127.0.01 platform, right? So that is basically local host. So once you double click that, it will ask you to provide the root password. Um, my password is saved in the MySQL vault. Okay, there is a vault where you can choose to save your password. Then for consecutive logins, you don't have to write the password every time, right? But make sure that is your private computer and it doesn't have any public access, right? So this is basically this what you're seeing right now on my screen is basically the SQL query script. Okay, so if you don't see this, information or this query script, then you can essentially go here, which is create a new SQL tab for executing queries, right? And then you can basically do the same set of commands that you did in the command line interface. That is you can do show databases, okay, and thereafter you can select this whole piece and then you can execute it, and then down here you can see the results. Okay, so you can choose to bring your result grid here on the side. You can remove this part here. You can just interact with your interface and then set it up based on your liking. Okay, so just play around with it, tinker with it a bit, the other setup options, and then set it up the way you want it to be, right? So you can show databases and then you can do use world. This step is basically essential. You have to, once the first time that you log into your server, you have to specify which database you want to work with, and that for that the command is basically use. Okay, so you can run that and it will say 0 rows affected. There is no result to it, but it gave me a affirmation that my execution was successful, right? If I typed something which was a bit which is not a recognized command, then it will give you a cross mark here along the lines of, let's say, if I do, instead of show table, if I do shows table. And of course, as you can see, my syntax highlighter also went away, and then the interpreter basically shows me that it cannot recognize this command. So if I forcefully try to execute this command, it'll give me the error code and then why it is not acceptable, right? So this is basically where the debugger is. And if you face a error that you cannot figure out, and this is a bit later on for the class, then you can essentially use this prompt and then you can do some Stack Exchange researching in order to figure out what the error is, right? So other than that, when you execute this command, then it will show you, and then you can go for the remaining commands such as describe city, which is going to essentially give you the schema of the table that you're working with if you're trying to understand what is the structure of the table you're going to interact with. Okay, so forgot. So anyways, can I remember what I was trying to say? No, yeah. So this one here, which is like this Harry Potter scar or Thor's lightning, whatever it is that you want to call it, with the one symbol, is basically to execute the SQL command on which your cursor is, right? Whereas if you execute this one, it is going to execute all the queries that are there, and then in a tabular fashion, separated by tabs, it's going to basically show you the information. Okay, so you can select and choose whatever you want. So that is basically for the installation of your MySQL community server, and then verifying the installation either using traditional means or with the help of MySQL Workbench. Okay, so the next topic is to use basically MySQL Workbench in order to draw your ERDs, or you can restate that and say that to produce the conceptual design of your database projects. Okay, so again, once you're in MySQL, right, and if you don't see any of these, So what you do is you can go to File and then select what is known as a new model. Remember, data model builds conceptual design, right? So you want to build a new model. Okay, so that is why you have a model. When you open up a model, then you see something along these lines. So if you go here to add diagram and you double click that, then this is basically going to open up your enhanced entity relationship diagram. Okay, you are doing an entity relationship diagram to begin with, but MySQL is by default going to push through enhanced entity relationship diagram. So if you want to do it, then you can do it. And this is your canvas and your palette uh, for the different uh, essential components or the building blocks of data models that we had discussed, right? So in this palette, you have all the required blocks that you have. What you will be dealing with most often is basically displace a new table, then the text object one in order to label your relationships, and essentially your relationships. Okay, so there are a few repetitions of the relationships. That is, you have a dotted line versus you have a solid line. So this is basically to represent the relationship strength between different types of entities, right? Whether it is a uh, identifying relationship or a non-identifying relationship, or a strong or a weak relationship, essentially. So we will cover this in another video when we will be discussing about the entity relationship model, okay, which is chapter 4, where we will talk about how many different types of attributes are there, what is the difference between them, what are the different types of relations, relationship participation, relationship strength, what is the differences between a weak entity and a strong entity, and what are the different types of relationship degrees. So once we cover that and you go through that video, you will essentially figure out the differences between the dotted line and the straight solid line, right? But basically that is what you have. But as you can see that for m is to n or n is to m, same thing. You don't have a dotted line, okay? Because m is to n is always going to be a strong identifying relationship, okay? So don't worry about that right now when you're looking at this video. But if you have already covered the other video for chapter 4, then you will have an idea of what these differentiations means, okay? So what you can do is you can take a table and you can essentially just left click the table and then left click within the canvas, and then it will put the table here, right? And after that, what you can do is you can double click this table without fighting to edit it, and then it will open an editor right below here, right, where you can place the information. So let's say I can do a table name. So entity name is always capitalized, so professor, okay? And then right below this table name, you have your attribute information, right? So you can double click and then you can do professor underscore ID. And then in the data type, if you click the data type, then you can drop it down and see all the different available data types that you have here. And you can select the one that you want, right? And it is by default selected as a primary key, and it cannot be null. So this is primary key, this is not null. This is for unique, that means there cannot be any duplicate values, okay? And other stuffs that we are going to learn as we go ahead, okay? So B, okay, B stands for binary, and then you have unsigned data type, that is the value cannot be negative, and thereafter you have the default fill up, okay, zero fill, okay, if you want to fill the values, if any value is missing in order to avoid any kind of null values and stuff like that. And then you have auto increment, that is if you have a primary key and you want to let the database server manage the value as you enter a new record, then you can basically select it as auto increment, and then you can select a generate column in order to generate any other column that you want based on that, okay? And then default is basically if you want to provide the column with any default value in case the user or whoever is using or interacting with the database does not provide any values, then by default it applies that value to it, okay? So thereafter, let's do another sample column, and let's say professor name, and then professor department. Okay, and then here we can change the size of the data set, the attribute domain, and we can say that it's going to be just 5 characters, and here you have 45 characters for varchar, right? So as you make changes here in this editor, then it's going to reflect here in the palette as well, or in the canvas, right? So once that is done, if you look at the bottom here, if you come down to the bottom and pay attention here, the first one is column information. Thereafter, you have different indexes. So if you want to make an index on a specific attribute value, then you can choose to do that. Otherwise, you can leave it blank for now. And then you have foreign key information. That is, if this table is in relation with another entity, then you can specify the foreign table here and the reference table here. Since we just have a one table right now, we cannot do it. And then triggers is something that we will discuss in my advanced MySQL. We don't want to do that right now. And you have other options that you can check it out, but we won't be engaging with them as far as just the design, the ER design is concerned. So let's go ahead and make another table. Let's say we do this, and then double click. And let's say the table name is student. Okay. So the first is student ID, and again it's going to be primary key. Okay, and then I have student name. Okay, and let's say it will be not null, and then I have student department as well, just for the sake of uniformity, which is also going to be not null. Okay, so I can go back to professor, double click it, and I can make my attribute not null as well. Okay. All right. So now that we have student and we have professor, what remains is to establish a relationship between them. So let's go for our most favorite relationship, that is professor advises a student, right? So that is a 1:m relationship from professor being the one side and m being the student side. So I'm going to select a dotted one, and then I'm going to select the m side first, and then I'm going to select the one side. Remember, m side first and then one side. Okay. 1:1, it doesn't matter because it's going to, in terms of representation, it's going to show the same way. But if you want to rephrase that in a much accurate terms, select the table first, which is the object of the relationship, and then select the table which is the subject of the relationship. Okay. So now you can adjust it, make it look pretty and stuff like that. And then go to this, place a new text object. So select that, click the text object, and then double click the text object, and then you can put the label which is advices. Okay, you don't want this to be capitalized, you just want it to be advices, and then you can give a name to this. It's like professor advises student. Okay, something along these lines. So now if you click student and if you go to the foreign keys, then you will see that MySQL has automatically specified the foreign key name and then the reference table. Okay, so here if you want to change the name of the foreign key, you can basically do professor ID. Okay, and then leave it as such. All right, so after that, if you want to cascade it, that is, any changes to the professor will be reflected to the student as well, then you can do some cascading operation here. But this is more of a later SQL operations and stuff like that. Do not skip the SQL generation, because as I said previously in another video, is anything that you're going to be doing here in terms of design, you can use what is known as the forward engineering option of MySQL database in order to generate the code for implementation from database and then forward engineer. Okay. So once this is done, you can keep on adding more what you call it, entities and relationships here, okay, in this palette using the same way. So this is one way of doing it. And in the MySQL model, you can rename your database, right? You can change your database name to, let's say, University Management. Okay, University MGMNT, something like this. Okay, rename references, and then go back to our ER design, and let's make sure that everything is all right. See, so now the name has changed to University Management.Professor instead of MyDB.Professor. So this is one way of doing it, where you can traditionally open a new model from File, New Model, then go to the new model and then double click Add Diagram, which will open this palette and then this canvas, and then using these palettes here, you can select whatever you want, left click, and then left click in the canvas, double click the object that has arrived, and then from the editor down below you can add the information that you want. Okay, and then you can select all and then move everything around. Okay, and once that is done, then you can go to File, Export, and then you have the options of how do you want to export this design that you want. So you can export it as a PNG, and you can save it somewhere, or you can export it as a PDF and then you can paste it in your PDF file. Okay, but make sure that whatever you export is readable. Okay, because here you see it in a much more enhanced resolution, but when you export it, verify that everything is readable to a normal human being. Okay, that you don't have to squint your eyes in order to figure out what have you done. All right, so this is one of the ways where you could do it. There's also another faster way where you don't have to drag and drop every object and then double click and change it, right? So if I remove this, let's say I remove this as well. So the other way of doing it, which in my opinion is a bit more faster than trying to drag and drop, is to use this part here. So now you can go to this and I can write University and then MGMNT. Okay, so once I have named this, so instead of going to the diagram first, what I can do is I can add a table. So now I can do the changes here. So I can write professor, and then I can do professor ID, and then primary key, and then professor name, not null, and then professor department. Okay, which is also going to be not null. Let's just keep it at 5. All right, so this is done. So once this is done, I close it, and then I add another table, and I do student, and then add student ID, make it the primary key, and then student name, make it not null, and then student department, which is not null as well. Okay, so now I can go to foreign key, and I can give the foreign key name as professor ID, and then I can go to reference table, and it will, and if you double click it, it will give you a drag down option of what you can refer to. So now you can refer to this. Okay, and thereafter, once that is done, partitioning is not required, options, insert, and assign roles, triggers, foreign key. Okay, so once that is done, you close it, and then you don't want to add any of these, and then you add the ER diagram for all of these tables. Okay, so now if you want to do any changes, then you can specifically do the changes from here. Okay, so you can basically do this. So the moment you bring the other table, it will generate the relationship from that kind of operations. So it is easier to add everything here and prep up your relationships and your tables if you know what you're going to do. And then when you add the diagram, you can simply just expand the tables column and you can drag everything into the palette one by one, and it will just generate the diagram by itself. So you don't have to use this and then come here, drop it, edit it, and then assign the roles, right? But however, if you're visually more comfortable in order to establish these relationships, then it is easier. You can simply just do it using the palette objects rather than doing it from the model part here, right? But the only thing that it cannot generate for you is, of course, the labels. So you still have to do that manually by importing the palette objects here and then providing the text for your text box. Okay, so then you can move it around and stuff like that. Another thing to note is that if you create any kind of relationship between two tables, which is m is to n, okay, so I don't have any value, so it cannot do it. So if you create this, okay, so let's put a primary key here, and then let's put a primary key here, and thereafter close this, and then if we select this, and then this. So what I'm trying to say here is anytime that you try to do a m is to n relationship, which is a logical relationship within the MySQL Workbench, MySQL will by default generate the linking table for you, okay, or the bridge table for you. Thereafter, if you want to change the name of the bridge table, you want to assign a separate primary key, then you are free to do that. But you don't have to worry about the differences. So this is one thing that is important, because since this design can be translated to the actual implementation code, unlike other platforms where you can draw your ER diagrams, wherein it does not, by default expands the m is to n into 2 1 is to m with a linking table, MySQL Workbench is going to do it because it needs to convert that code into actual implementation code. And remember, there is no direct implementation for n is to m or m is to n, right? We have discussed this before, and we know what the issues are if we try to do it, right? So that's why the moment you specify that there is an m is to n relationship between any two or more entities, Workbench is going to, by default, expand that with the help of a linking table or a bridge entity. Okay, so that is another benefit of working within the MySQL Workbench environment rather than some other tool which can also help you draw the ER diagrams. So it's not as flashy as you would like to be, but there is some added advantages later on, which is basically when you go to database and forward engineer this, right? Then you can keep on going it. Okay. So here you have other options that you can choose with respect to your code generation. You can go through it if you want to, and stuff like that, right? So whatever you want to do. So thereafter, once you do that, as you can see here, the entire database environment generation code that you have, which is represented by this design, which is not complete right now because there are missing connections between the remaining entities, right? Which is okay. If there is no interaction between the entities, there is no interaction between the entities, has been auto-generated. So it is helping you skip a lot of implementation coding that you might have to do if you generate your design in a different platform, or if you do not generate your design properly. So that is the reason why there is a very strong emphasis that Give effort to generate a good design. It will cut down your work later on during the implementation, because if your design is foolproof or as robust as it can be, then you can essentially avoid a very big part of your implementation code when it comes to the logical design portion, right? Then you can focus solely on the data transformation techniques, on writing database transactions. So it's going to speed up your process by a lot. Okay, so just something to keep in mind. Okay, so this is one way where you can generate the implementation code, and again you can go to export, and then you can forward engineer the script from there, and it will bring you to the same option. Similarly, later on at a later stage, if you are responsible for, if in your work environment, if you get a database implementation code and you need to know what the design is and whether you can improve it, then you use basically the option of reverse engineering, where you will provide it the code and then it will generate the ER design for you. Okay. So that is basically the content of this particular video, right? So as we go to the next chapter, which is chapter 4, ER model, we will specifically talk about uh, the subcomponents of the ER design, right? So I will see you all again in the next lecture video. Until then, stay safe and take care.